The topic we're considering, which is inequality, is central in two respects. It's central to the CED as an issue in and of itself. It's also a central part of this long-term project, this inquiry of ours on the future of capitalism, and again, for quite obvious reasons. Let me do very brief introductions. Bios are in your packet, and I'm not going to spend any more time than that. And Betsy's already been introduced. There is, let me introduce it from proceeding to the right of Betsy, Kevin Hassett, who's the Director of Policy Studies at AEI. And if you spend any time on economics and you spend any time on policy and economics, you know his name. He's one of the most distinguished commentators on economic policy around. Bernard Bailey is the CEO of Authentix. He's also an adjunct professor at Case Western Reserve, and he's an expert in corporate governance. Linda McMahon is the former CEO of WWE. She now heads McMahon Ventures. She was a former candidate for the United States Senate, and most illustrative of all, she's the co-chair of the CED's Education Task Force. And finally, Beth Ann Bovino is the chief economist at Stanford & Poor's. She was recognized in 2013 by the Wall Street Journal as the street's most accurate forecaster. There are sometimes arguments that that's a low bar, but in this particular case it wasn't. And if she seems particularly nervous right now, she told me at lunch that she has delegated the task of purchasing their home to her husband. And let me tell you, that's a delegation that doesn't occur very often. My role is to be a policeman and to get us from the beginning to end with a constructive discussion. I'm going to do a brief and extremely neutral framing. And Betsy really provided a lot of that, so I've cut mine down. We're going to discuss, not present, and I'm going to try to do that by a series of more rapid-fire questions. If we can, we'll leave some time, but we may not have a lot of time. And we're going to look at three broad questions, which I'll define in a minute. Let me frame the topic. And I'm not going to go through numbers. There are endless disputes about numbers, endless disputes about the economic series that you're looking at, the adjustments that were made to them, and so on and so on. I'm going to exercise a chair's discretion and not allow those disputes. But first, inequality of both income and wealth is substantial and has grown. Why is widely disputed. The top, whether you define it as the top 10%, 1%, or 0.1%, has broken away as inequality is widened. We're losing the middle in terms of job growth, and social mobility in America, while it has been broadly constant over a period of time, it is now less than in many other developed nations. And it is declining now for the lowest 20% of the income distribution. So we do face, our economy now poses issues of substantial income and wealth inequality, falling social mobility for some, the losing of middle-level jobs. We want to ask three questions. What's driving this? Of what is happening, what do we really care about, and what should we do about it? I'm going to clump those and ask the first, what's driving this, of our three economists. And then I'm going to ask Linda and Bernard to comment if they choose on aspects of what the economists say. Now, my view of this was it's possible that what the economists will say will be incomprehensible, so therefore we need people to comment. Let me start, and it's a little unfair to ask, having been in the position Betsy is in at the moment, it's a little unfair to ask a sitting member of the Council of Economic Advisors to make a particular comment, so she can give it a pass. But the question really is, spend 2 minutes, and I'll do this with the economists at the start, on saying what do you think are the preeminent drivers of whether structural or not, in terms of the inequality we're seeing? And if there's a major secondary one, what's that? And Betsy, you can pass if you want.
Why don't I pass since I've had so much time to speak already?
Kevin.
Oh, okay. Gosh, I thought I had 2 minutes to think. I think that if we want to think about what's driving wages, that I like to go back to my first economics class and think about where does the wage come from. There are really three things that I think are key factors. One is how much capital does a person have to work with? If the amount of capital per worker is going up, then you at least have a precondition where their productivity would go up and their wage could go up. The second thing is what's going on with their human capital. Is their human capital going up or isn't it? And if it is, then again, that sets a condition where maybe their wage could be going up. And the third thing is what's going on with their bargaining position with respect to capital. And so you could imagine you go back to the 1800s, I grew up in Greenfield, Massachusetts. It was a little mill town. There really might have been only one employer in the town, and maybe you bought all your stuff from their store. And so maybe if your productivity went up, you didn't have necessarily a lot of power over the employer to make sure that the next time your wage was set, that you captured some of that productivity. And so I like to think about it looking at wage trends, which I agree Betsy did a great job of laying out the facts, that the wage trends have been very disappointing. And for me, I think the puzzle is how do we allocate it among those three factors? I think that the top factor for me is the first one. I think that capital growth in the US has been pretty disappointing. I think it's related to stuff, the president recognizes this too, in our corporate tax code that chases the capital overseas, and so there's less capital for workers to work with. I think human capital has been a problem, especially not necessarily just in terms of what's happened to the middle of the distribution, but the whole inequality question, because I think that there are schools that are doing great and schools that are really failing, and there seems to be a lot of kind of memory to your family's circumstances, especially in bad income circumstances and bad geographic circumstances. The third one, and this would be maybe one place where I would disagree with some of my friends on the left, although I've never talked about this with anybody at the CEA, is that I would guess that bargaining power for workers in the US is actually better than it used to be. Because really, ultimately, if I'm gonna, so say Betsy's and I are fighting over a worker, and they have $20 of product. If I pay him $10, then you can pay him $11, and then I'll try to pay him $12, and before you know it, the wage is gonna be pretty close to $20. But the way the worker gets power over the employer is that he creates, basically a bidding war for himself. And I think with the internet and everything else, it's a lot easier for people to look around and find other positions if they have an employer they don't like, to look for a new job and so on. And so for me, I think that the focus should be on the first two. I think a lot of the sort of popular discussion and the discussion that came from Thomas Piketty's book and so on focused on things that are really in that third category, but that's not where I would focus my attention.
Can I call for my lifeline? No, just kidding. Just kidding. I'll yeah, exactly. See how he's doing with the inspection of our house. I'm really concerned. Anyway, so that's what I was doing when Bo saw me talking on the phone, making sure that he checked all the appliances. A little worried about that, but I'm sure it'll go fine. If not, he will be punished. So anyway, in terms of income inequality, at least, or increased income concentration over the last 3 or 4 decades, I think it's been across all aspects. I'm really kind of basing a lot of this on the CBO studies that have been done. You saw increased concentration of income at the labor side of it. Education, I think, was a big factor in that, and I'll talk a little bit about that, although Betsy covered a bit of it already. Business income was a factor. Also capital income, excluding capital gains, also increased in income concentration, and then capital gains themselves. You also could see that policy was a factor in terms of tax changes and where income has been held. For example, there's been a change in terms of holdings of income, focused on the higher income households, holding much more, being taxed more on personal income, where taxes have been lowered, less on labor-wise, while at lower income households, it would be more taxed on labor, where you didn't really see an increase or a decrease in taxes. So that could be a factor as well. But let's focus on education, because that seems to be and actually infrastructure in general. When you think about it, education is social infrastructure, and I would actually say that infrastructure in general has been pretty much slack in the United States. We have a D+ according to, what is it, the, I'm sorry, I might get the association wrong, Association of American Civil Engineers, I believe was the title, yeah. D+, I think we have right now, that we actually improved. We were a D, I think, earlier, so we did get a better grade, but still barely passing. So infrastructure, I think, is one factor that certainly has been slim and certainly reduces the interest in businesses doing business here. That's certainly one hurdle to jump. Another hurdle to jump, I think, is education, something Betsy talked a bit about. She already gave a couple of those points about the so-called college premium. I think this is tied to basically the advancement in technology at the same time that basically education has been slowing down. And so you're starting to see this very large college premium. 2 times a college graduate makes 2 times more than a high school graduate. It goes further. It goes into net income, net wealth as well. It used to be that college graduates made about 2 times what a high school graduate had in net wealth. Now it's 3.5 times. So these are factors that I think are at play. I know we want to keep going I know we want to keep going. I can go on and on about education, but I'll stop there and pass it to you.
You get another chance. Linda?
Thank you for stopping on education, because that's where I was going to come in. I really wanted to follow along on the prior panel. I think most of you probably were here to hear that. And serving on the Education Committee for CED and also being on the Board of Trustees of Sacred Heart University in Connecticut, I really do see more and more, the lapses in how we are fulfilling, as it was noted in the last panel, that talent pipeline. And how do we reach out from our educational institutions to the business world to see what they need? When I was campaigning for the Senate in Connecticut, I toured many, many businesses all across the state. Precision manufacturing companies were a big part of Connecticut's economy. And one of the things that without fail was discussed was the lack of skilled workers coming in to businesses, and that was a whole new skill. That was computer-trained workers who could come in and operate the new machinery. I mean, they manufacture things, but it's all input now. But it doesn't require that you write the programs. It's just having the skill to put the programming into these machines. Really good paying jobs. However, I would note on the other side of that, many of these business owners said to me, there is this misperception about manufacturing. And when you're going to high school and you're talking to young students, men and women, about entering the world of manufacturing, they still perceive the manufacturing workplace as dirty, heavy equipment manufacturing that they don't want to have any part of. So I do think we have, as part of our education process, to let them know that this new world of technological manufacturing is a whole new area. And we can improve that pipeline by improving that communication on both supply side and demand side.
I think when we look at, listening to the economists as we go through this, and the question really becomes, how do we look at this in terms of the structural issues around the economic system? And it seems that that's how the economists look at it. But let's do a little thought experiment here. If we had a country of 100 million families, and both spouses were working in those families, making $50,000 a year, you'd have each family making $100,000. And of course, what the economists seem to focus on is the Gini coefficient, which in that case would be 0. But then all of a sudden, overnight, if half of those families ended up in a divorce or got separated in some way, you'd end up not with 100 families now, or 100 million families, but 150 million families, of which 100 million of the families would have an income of $50,000 each. All of a sudden, the Gini coefficient has gone up considerably, and we have significant income inequality in the country. Now, why do I make that example? I make that example because I don't think it's right to simply look at the income inequality issue only around an economic structural issue. I think I look at it and tend to look at it more like Michael Novak does, as really a democratic capitalism problem, which is really an economic system that's embedded in a political system as well as a cultural system in this country. And unless we take, as Carl Camden talks about, a systems approach that looks at all three of these systems, our culture, our political system, as well as our economic system, I don't think we're going to come close to making the progress we want to. So when the political system is captured by rent seekers, it disenfranchises much of America. And it loses control in terms of where the income gets distributed and how the pie gets distributed. At the same time, when we have an economic system that's been built in this country, and we talk about, has it changed? Absolutely, we've heard it changed. But at the same time, we watched our cultural system change radically also. You know, and a lot of people, while it may not be something exactly politically correct to say, but American is and was exceptional and continues to be exceptional. And by exceptional, I use the definition not that we're something exceptionally different in terms of better than somebody else, but rather we're different. Our system was different. It was built on individualism. It was built on the sense of family. It was built on a non-secular view in terms of how we work together in society, in terms of our morality and how we believe and how that's enforced in the community. And clearly that's shifted. And just as kind of an example of that, you know, as mentioned, I teach at Case Western in Cleveland, and I often stay downtown in a hotel, and I take the City Line bus. Now, unless you're a New Yorker, probably most of you have never been on a city bus in quite a while. And I'll tell you, it's a different experience. This line happens to run down Euclid Avenue along the entire length of Cleveland. And Euclid Avenue, for those of you that your only knowledge about Cleveland is when it burned, should recognize that at that point in time, that Euclid Avenue used to be the most beautiful avenue in America. But if you ride that bus today, what you'll see is mostly, and I don't care if you get on it at 10 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, or 8 o'clock at night, it's mostly 16 to 25-year-olds. They're completely disenfranchised from society. The way they talk, the way they behave, the way they dress, the way they comport themselves, any of us would look at that and say, they're not employable. And we basically have taken an element of our society, and how are we going to make it a functional piece and a productive piece of the society, and how do we integrate it together? So I think we need to take a much larger view of it.
Thank you very much. I want to note just one thing for Steve Idland's benefit, which is that he told me quite proudly before this that he had finally figured out what economists mean by the term rent. And I promised him that sometime this discussion it would be used, and if it wasn't, I would use it. But Bernard has in fact used it. Betsy, do you want to say anything
sure.
in summation?
Yeah. No, I was going to say one thing is just to be really careful about the question that we're asking, because you started with the question of what's causing the rise in inequality.
Yep.
There's also the question of what's causing the stagnation in middle class incomes, and that was part of what my comments were trying to address. What I didn't talk about is we did some counterfactual exercises and said, okay, well, what if we had the rise in inequality that we've had, but we had the productivity growth that we had between 1948 and 1973? What would have happened to middle class incomes? And we found that they would be 51% higher today. So obviously rising income inequality has contributed to the stagnation of wages. But in fact, as a factor, perhaps more, what's been even more important has been the slowdown in productivity growth. So I just wanted to emphasize that it depends a little bit on what you're talking about. So then Kevin's question of how important is bargaining power to the stagnation of middle class incomes is much smaller than how important is bargaining power in terms of the rise of inequality.
Okay, thanks. Well, I tried to draw a distinction between the stagnation issue and the inequality issue precisely because of what the council's work has been. But we can merge the distinction now because I want to ask, what do you care most about, and what do you think we ought to do about it? And at this point, for this one, once again, I'm going to allow, unless you want to comment immediately, it's hard to ask a senior official of the president to choose between his or her policies. So I won't. So again, let's start. We'll go this time this way. So, Beth Ann,
On my side, you can always say, if you say anything that goes against the president, we won't tell him. Nobody. We'll keep it. It'll be hush hush. So, I mean, I guess there's a lot of things that can be done. We focused. We did a report back last year, and we focused on education, kind of the education aspect of the question of income inequality, and actually education, when you think of it, also improves productivity. So maybe that actually helps on that end as well. We kind of looked at what will be the impact on education if we have seen it lagging, as was discussed, and we have seen education lagging for some time. And it's not just college. When you think about it, it's not just college. It's also, do you have the education through K through 12 to be able to get through college, even if you do get in? So one of the things that we looked at on education, particularly also because we see it as a pro-growth solution, it actually expands the economy. It makes the U.S. more competitive with our basically our trading partners. It makes us more competitive with what's happening in a very global market economy. So what we did was a kind of a quick study is what if we increase the workforce in the United States, the education in the workforce over a 5-year period by just 1 year. Now, we came up with this number because this was not something that was out of the ordinary. It's something that we had done in the 60s. 1960 to 1965, if you look at it, actually, the workforce, on average, gained 1 year of education over that period, and certainly that was a strong period for the U.S. So what we saw when we did that, over that 5-year period, we saw that the U.S. economy would expand, potential growth would expand by about $500 billion from where it would be if we hadn't done that. We see that as a reason because it was basically more productivity in the United States, creates more business, creates more product, and actually grows more wealth, grows the pie, as you could say. So that's something that we were pretty focused on. One thing, though, that I want to note, and this is actually for everyone in the audience to consider, while I'm very pro on actually improving education in the United States and also increasing it as well, what we've seen, a couple of things that came out, is that the millennials are the most educated cohort in the generation in the United States, according to Pew and some other research as well. But what we've also seen is that we've seen default rates start to increase, according to the New York Fed had just put out a recent report that we're starting to see default rates on student loans increasing now in the double-digit area, and there's a lot of people who have taken deferment. They also did an analysis, looked at it by zip code, and what they found, there was a significant amount of the default rates in low-income neighborhoods. So the question is now is we always think that you get an education, you're always going to get the return, a strong return from that education. Is there a disconnect? Is there a problem here? And it's something that I would hope other people will look at and study.
Thank you. And education, of course, will do so many things. But I think we also can look at this from a little different practical experience. What are we doing as business leaders to help create more opportunity? Because if we can create more opportunity, we create growth and we create productivity. I'm working with an organization called Women's Leadership Live. And part of what we're doing is helping women be leaders in their communities, leaders in their business. I mean, you hear so many of these kind of programs, but there is really a need, not just for women, but also for young entrepreneurs, for capital. Sometimes it's microlending. It's just that little bit extra that someone needs to get into the job market, because really what we want to do, if we want to help shift some of this inequality, is to create more opportunity. It does create more jobs. It does create more wealth. It does create more people in the workplace doing different kinds of jobs. And I think that's one of the things that we need to focus on. If we can, through education, yes, but through encouragement, providing sometimes as little as a helping hand in our communities, from a philanthropic point of view, creating more scholarships, creating more opportunities for young people to have those internships that Ed was talking about on the prior panel. If we get people involved, I really do believe it is about opportunity to grow and develop You know, I am a product of this country and a product of the American dream. I mean, I'm a success in business coming from a very modest background. And what we want to do is to make sure that we can continue to have that American dream in this country through our policies, through our taxes, through making sure that we have the right education opportunity. But we also need to make sure that that next generation of potential workers has that same work ethic. I have to tell you, I heard a lot from those same business owners that I talked to throughout Connecticut. And they talked about how there was a lack of that spirit of innovation and just commitment to job from some of those young people who did come into the company. But they would come in and work started at 9 o'clock, you come in at 5 of 9, but you got to go do all these things. You got to grab a cup of coffee, you got to do all these other things, and it's like 9:15 before you're really ready to work. And if you're supposed to get off at 5 o'clock, 4:45, you're already looking at the clock and packing up your desk. Now, there's a lot of our continuing education on the practical side of life at commitment to making sure that you do a job well. And I think we can't ignore some of these basics as we look to grow, continued growth and opportunity.
Bernard, you have a particular burden in saying what you care the most about and what do you want to do about it, because you took a somewhat different slant than much of the rest of the panel in raising exactly these questions. And when we talked about it, you alluded to Putnam's work, our kids. So you've got to say, among the other things you solve in your next 2 minutes, you got to solve those problems.
In 2 minutes, yeah. Well, I go back to the example in Cleveland, and unfortunately, you know, and I've listened to Putnam, and on the left is Putnam, who is Robert Putnam, who wrote the book Bowling Alone, and just his most recent book, which is Our Kids Now, in which he talks about these issues of how we're creating this chasm. At the same time, though, over on the right is Charles Murray, who writes about the same issues. And they both come to the exact same point. Now, their solutions are different, but they come to the exact same point, that we have this disenfranchised segment of our society. What's interesting is when you ask them, what can you do about that, they basically say, there's no answer. There's no solution today for the 16-year-old to the 30-year-old that's been disenfranchised. So how do we handle then the next generation? And that's where the focus has to be in terms of how do we handle that next generation to make them, playing off your point, Linda, of make them fit for coming to work. Right? Because if you look at the World Economic Forum did a recent study on this, and 19% of the CEOs said the big problem they have in skills is not whether they can do a derivative or they can take the double integral. The real question is, can they just get up, dress up, and show up for work? Because 19% of them feel that they can't even get people who have the basic cultural requirements to show up and be good workers in society. And we're losing that in terms of how we do that. So, you know, again, now we get to that other kind of lightning rod, which is minimum wages. And there's no doubt that you know, somebody can't live on a minimum wage. I'm not sure how many people in our society really expect to live and work in a minimum wage their entire life. But what it certainly does, and the Congressional Budget Office said, that it keeps 2 million people from entering the workforce every year. 2 million people who can start to learn what it means to get up, come to a job, look people in the eyes, learn the basic tenets of what work is about, so that they can then go on and get the right technical skills to work. So from a bargaining power standpoint, I agree with you completely. Bargaining power, I've been in high technology businesses and high skilled workers. Every day I worry about them walking out, the skills walking out the door, right? I think it's a different world on the low skilled side. They don't have the bargaining power. And they don't have the bargaining power, and so how do they get it in terms of creating skills and creating capabilities? And it's more than just education in a book sense. It's education about how do you work in a culture that's important to producing a better society.
I think that it's useful to start by thinking about, well, what is the actual definition of the problem that we're trying to address? And I think that I view it as, again, maybe like you go into a slightly higher level. The problem is not just that there are pockets in our country, some just a few miles from us right here, where, if you grow up in that neighborhood, then, your wage is going to be a lot lower than a, kid who grows up in a neighborhood that's not so afflicted. So part of the problem is that there are these places that desperately need our attention and our help that don't get enough attention and help from the government. But the second part of the problem, my view is that everybody in this room wants to do something about it. Everybody in this room wants to try to help make these kids have a better life, but nobody knows how to do it and how to participate themselves in the solution. And defining the problem this way is what moved my somewhat strange bedfellow Jared Bernstein and I released a paper last week where we thought hard about what we ought to do if that's the problem. And basically, after a big lit review, found ourselves believing that what we need to do is think of our nation as having a kind of Manhattan Project level challenge of restoring order and economic vitality to the worst off geographic regions in our country. And Jared and I have put forward a very rough sketch of a proposal that basically would create a tax-advantaged investment vehicle way more powerful than any enterprise zone project that we've ever seen before, that would, one, give people in this room an opportunity to make a difference. Because when you go to Vanguard and you have your money in the Index 500 and you're thinking, well, maybe I'll move it over to the Dividend Growth Fund, if there was a fund in there where you knew that that fund was going to invest in disadvantaged areas in the country, then you would feel motivated to invest in that fund. We could imagine a new social norm where businesses would advise their workers to contribute X percent of their wages to development-based funds. But I think that's the kind of place where we need to move the conversation. Is it like, what are the problems that we can all agree about? What can we do to empower not just the government, but ourselves to do something about it, and let's pursue policies that do that. I think that the problem right now is that, first, a lot of our education investments are very geographically based. So there's completely unacceptable geographic variation in the quality of schools, for example. And the problem, though, is that if you want to go, if you just go across Pennsylvania Avenue Bridge and go out, Minnesota Avenue, then you're going to find a convenience store where you can't even go in. I don't know if you've not been to that part of the town, that if you want to get a bag of Doritos, you go to the front of the store and they have like a bank drawer, and you say, what do you want? And you say, I want Doritos, and they'll slide it out through the bank drawer because that neighborhood is so tough. Now basically what's going on is we're not doing anything to help those places. We're just looking the other way. And when we're thinking, okay, let's have an enterprise zone so that somebody can go in there, then what we're doing is we're really lowballing it so that we're basically encouraging a small business to go over there and try to make a go of it. But it's a much bigger problem than that. And so for me, I think there's a lot that we can do, but it requires being much more ambitious than we've been.
And innovative. Betsy, do you want to make a couple of points? We're going to end like a guillotine at exactly 2:45.
Well, I was just going to say that as an economist and an academic, when you think about inequality, there's just so many different levels to it. Right, that was just a discussion really about poverty. And yet perhaps one of the more confusing things is the within-group inequality that has risen across the board. And I even see it in my own profession of PhD economists. The amount of inequality that we have today compared to the past is just enormous. And so I think that's just to say that there's not one solution, and that's why we can't prioritize, and we pull out the president's agenda and there's a million things on it that are all trying to get at these various issues of middle-class income and inequality. And it's not because he's indecisive, but because it's a multifaceted problem, and you want to be able to tackle all the different aspects of it, because I'm concerned about the within-group inequality and not, as well as poverty, as well as the issues that were just being discussed.
a minute of summation. What's striking, and we didn't plan it this way, is that if you go across the board, the focus really is on the human capital side of the problem. I'm sorry to use the multiple syllabic words, and that in two respects, but both of which are kind of parallel. One is the formal, what we've thought of as the formal investment and achievement of educational attainment, but the second is the more informal processes summarized by the kinds of points that Linda was making and that Bernard was making. One final element was then thrown in by Kevin, which is really intriguing to me, which is the perhaps turning the notion of impact investing much more toward the United States and less, or as much as we do toward other nations. I guess in the end, I would disagree with Betsy's final point, which is, while I think we're all well aware that the solutions are going to be broad spectrum, the thing is, I think as president after president after president has found, is that you only get to do 2 or 3 big things. And that if this whole area is an area where you're going to focus on doing 2 or 3 big things, whoever the next is, they better know what those 2 or 3 are when they come in, because they can't do 20. I want to thank the panelists very much for this discussion. I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And Betsy, thank you very much for your keynote that began this.
Thank you.